You can't sell a good economy, or you shouldn't have to, because people know. People know whether the economy is good or not based on their paychecks, when they go to the gas pump, when they go to the grocery stores, when they check their savings account. In 2019, Minnesota state GDP was ranked 36th in the country, 36th. Job growth was ranked 45th. In fact, for the last 10 years, the job growth in Minnesota has trailed the national average. But Tim Walz likes to talk about the unemployment rate right now, historically low. Well, the unemployment rate, another way to say that is your labor force participation rate. There's 130,000 less Minnesotans working today than there was pre-pandemic. 130,000. And he likes to talk about the growth of year over year. Well, when you shut down the economy, I would hope that you would have some pretty impressive growth numbers the next year. We also know that we are losing more people 18 to 26 are leaving this state than are coming, and people over 55. What does that say for our future when we're losing more people 18 to 26? And we also know that people making $50,000 or more at every single income level are leaving this state more than they are moving here. The first thing you have to do to fix a problem is admit that you have a problem. And we have some economic problems in this state that we need to address and we need to get taken care of. There's no such thing as staying the same. You're either getting better or you're getting worse. So we want to present today, like we do with everything, bring forth our ideas, our plans, what we've done since the beginning of this campaign, is our holistic approach to economic growth and prosperity.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming, I appreciate it. We're really not trying to be political per se. We think that this is the time where we should be putting out ideas. We should be putting together 10-point plans. You could talk about a white paper. What we're trying to do is say, when we came against inflation several months ago, if we did these things, we could mitigate what was happening. Imagine you saw the data this morning, and it's 8.3% inflation again. That's 3 months in a row it's been above 8%. Today's data shows that what they were expecting was, in terms of a shrinkage, it was more than double. So we have over and over again during this campaign said, listen, we're going to put ideas out there. And we'd love to have discourse. We'd love to have a conversation. I'm having a debate with Tim Walz next week. It'd be fun to have a conversation about what do you think we should do to stimulate the economy? What do you think we can do to fight against inflation? So today what we're doing is we're releasing a 10-point plan, and it's simply on jobs and economic redevelopment. That's all we're trying to do. Are these the only 10 points that should be included in a program like this? No, undoubtedly, as we have conversation with you folks and with Minnesotans, there will be more. And some of these might well be pushed downwards. But this is what we think, if you try to say, how could you do something short-term? How could you do something mid-term? How could you do something long-term? This is what we think we could do. First, we need to support mining and timber production. We right now have over 90% of the nickel reserves in the world are located in Minnesota. These metals are needed for energy cells, phones, computers, and you don't have nickel in that many places, and Minnesota is blessed to have it. We need to use it. We also have a timber industry that has sustained the Minnesota economy for centuries, and there's no reason not to give it more firepower. Each year we have more trees than we had the year before. There is no reason not to promote and incentivize our timber industry. New capital investments. We need to do things that are going to help some of those areas. I grew up in a town called Sleepy Eye. A few years ago, Sleepy Eye, Del Monte, their canning factory shut down. That was a huge deal for Sleepy Eye. Sleepy Eye is not alone. There's a lot of smaller communities in greater Minnesota and even some communities in the 7-county metro area that have gotten hammered or crushed by the loss of some of the businesses that heretofore had provided the economic stimulus that they needed to go forward. So what we need to do now is we need to identify tax-free enterprise zones, utilize tax credits for the job creators, but somehow we need to spread the wealth a little bit so we can get economic growth in more than just a few special localities. Expand job opportunities. How do you do that? Well, on the one hand, you need to reduce permitting times, regulations, red tape, and bureaucracy. But it's not one size fits all on this, because one way to diminish job opportunities is to have the people within a given industry make it more difficult for people to get into that industry. For instance, if there's a service that's being provided and it isn't regulated or licensed, if you regulate it and license it, then all of a sudden it becomes more difficult for people to penetrate that. While I was in the Senate, I remember things would come across my desk that sounded good, but when you really looked at it, it was going to make it more difficult for people to come into that industry. And I don't even know the specifics, but whether you're talking about a tattoo parlor or whatever. And all of a sudden what you were doing is you were basically helping people say, well, we got in here first and we're going to make it more difficult for other people to get in. In medicine, we've seen that happen with residency programs. We might have a need statewide or nationally for more physicians specializing in this area. But rather than see more resident physicians trained each year, oftentimes those residency programs would sort of shrink them down a little bit, sort of guaranteeing that there would be always, that kind of a specialist would always be a hot commodity. So I think we really need to recognize that when we expand job opportunities, there is two sides of this sword that have to be dealt with. The crime wave. We've seen, and I know many of you are aware of it, we've seen many businesses on Lake Street say we're not coming back. They've left. Some didn't have to. Some of them were still surviving after the riots had calmed down, but they left anyway. I think in Minneapolis, I think at one time the Star Tribune had printed an article that 95 or 96 restaurants had closed down in Minneapolis proper. We need to stop the crime. I think, I don't mean to get too political, but I think that what happened in the 2020 riots in May and June was bungled. I think it took a huge toll on small businesses. And unfortunately, I think it devastated a lot of minority-owned small businesses. And they haven't come back. I've gone down on Lake Street and met with people, and they say, why can't we get something going quicker? Presumably the dollars have been there, but it's not happening. Promote employment. We need to somehow come up with a workfare initiative where we get more Minnesotans working. And Matt Burke was correct. We have 130,000 less people. We need that employee participation rate to be increased. If Minnesotans will just think about it this way, every person who's out there working in one way or another is feeding the Minnesota GDP, and that's a good thing. That means that Minnesota will be stronger if we can have more and more people feeding the Minnesota GDP. But the way to do that is probably to take people that are physically, mentally, and emotionally capable and create a workfare initiative. I think we've all thought about this, that sometimes if a person is looking at rejoining the workforce and they're in this given situation, if they join the workforce, sometimes eligibility for some of the things that help sustain their lives at that time could go away. That causes fear, anxiety. We need to be more elegant, more nimble in finding a way to really spur people to get involved and be a part of that Minnesota economic engine. Improve access to opportunities. There's a specific program called Jumpstart Jobs, and it's a real easy one to access and find out what opportunities are out there. We need to make that happen. Things have changed a lot when I was applying for jobs where you're filling out these papers. There's all kinds of different programs, but if you specifically look at Jumpstart Jobs, that would help people. They would be able to find easier access to opportunities for which they may qualify. Affordable energy. We came to you 3 or 4 months ago and talked about our Energy 10-point plan, and one of the things we pointed out was that in 2008 or 2009, Tim Walz and Eric Paulson, as congressmen, had stood next to each other and called on the Minnesota legislature to remove the moratorium on nuclear power. That was 4 months ago, I think. We've not heard one comment from the Walz administration. If it was a good idea in 2008 or 2009, and we, if you will, elevated it a few months ago, why wouldn't you say, yeah, that's a good idea, we should definitely do that? It just seems that we're not really fired up enough to make a difference. We need to have affordable energy. We're not going to be able to abandon our fossil fuel sources of energy until we're ready to move into an area where we'll have a solid grid. And particularly when you look at wind and solar, those are tantalizing options, but they're not getting us where we need to be. Childcare. I was in the Senate when we saw the fraud and the waste with our child care programs. It seems to me like what happened is we got past that crisis, and now nobody wants to talk about it. But to take care of a child, your daycare cost is typically somewhere between $16,000 and $18,000 in a lot of places in the Twin Cities. I've got 2 grandchildren in one of my kids' families, and they pay $35,000 a year. It's astonishing. I don't have all the answers, but if you look at what we put here, we've got to provide options. We need to reduce the excessive regulations. A lot of times the regulations drive up the cost in ways we could not imagine. Certainly, if regulations cause some people to say, I've had enough, I'm done, I'm not going to do this. I didn't mind doing it for a while. It didn't make me wealthy. And I know my neighbors really appreciated the fact that I was willing to take in 3 kids. But I've had it. I think that happens to all of us. It's human nature. I think we're seeing it, it's a little bit of a segue, if you will, but we're seeing physicians now say, I've had it. Now, I'd love to participate, but I mean, I had a patient in this morning, and they wanted to know if I could fill this one script. I said, no. I said, you know what? To do pain control medicine right now, it is so fraught with red tape, rules, regulations. I gave up my privileges to do chronic opiate prescribing. And this doesn't necessarily, on a magna scale, serve the overall interests of healthcare. But I think it happens, and I'm just confessing that it's happened to me in regards to a 67-year-old physician who likes practicing, but also wants to have it be a little more hassle-free. Apprentice job training. We need to take 16, 17, and 18-year-olds in school, and we need to give them a more robust opportunity to start building real-life, real-world skills. I think some of our regulations and our challenges in permitting some of these situations have gotten out of hand. There is no reason why a 17-year-old who's really adept, she or he, really adept at backing in heavy equipment, using backhoes and all, let's get them out in the field as a part of their education. Let's teach them what it takes to be a highly productive person in some sort of heavy machinery industry, and let's make that happen. Let's get kids into hospitals and laboratories drawing blood, doing pulmonary function tests. Let's blow open the menu so that kids really feel like they can take that last 2 or 3 years in high school where they're still in that comfortable place, their parents' home, where they have a chance to try something and maybe fail and try something else. We need to do that more. And lastly, Minnesota tourism. Obviously, we're not going to be a Florida with Disney World and all the kinds of things that a warm climate state like that can do. But we can do more than we've been doing. And I think it's a legitimate argument that Minnesota regulations and permitting obligations and license requirements have made survival in tourism much more challenging than need be. These are the things that I think would absolutely allow Minnesota to become a more prosperous state. Again, if you look at some of the things we have in our 10-point plan, and I think you've all had a chance to see them, one of the things you'll see is that some of these are short-term things and some of them are more long-term things. And if I could just highlight the short-term things. Capital investments in tax-free enterprise zones is something that can be done in less than one legislative session. Reducing permit times and regulations is a short-term opportunity for us to change things. The crime wave, I get it. That's not going to be short-term. That's going to be midterm. That's not going to be done in a few months. That's going to take 1 to 3 years. We need more cops on the streets. You've heard me talk about this before. Mandated minimum sentences need to be just that. And if we're going to have judges and prosecuting attorneys not honoring the mandated minimum sentence, we're going to have to somehow provide a transparency level so that people know that, hey, this situation here over and over again doesn't seem to be responding to the way the Sentencing Guideline Commission had put it together. But I think the long term, promoting Minnesota tourism, we've crushed our tourism business compared to what it could be, in a pretty devastating fashion. I would consider that a long-term thing, and we're going to have to do that, and that's going to have to be crafted carefully. So in closing my comments, I just say this, and Matt Burke intimated, laying off a huge chunk of our workforce by government edict, and then allowing them to come back to work later and calling that job growth is just political spin. And we're seeing that around the nation. We're seeing people do that. So I think we need to be more honest with you. I think the voters see through such nonsense. And I think at the end of the day, when you look at what inflation is doing to the everyday family, people truly are exceedingly concerned about groceries, gas, heating their home, and paying their rent. Those are real world issues. And we are simply saying, better jobs, high-paying jobs, economic redevelopment, these are the things that can really, if you will, jumpstart Minnesota's economy. That's why we're here today, and I think there's only 3 or 4 weeks left in the campaign, so I think you're probably going to see 1 or 2 more template plans from us. I think we've got one that will focus on northern Minnesota, and then there's also one that we wanted to focus on some of those areas of urban requirement. Yeah. So, folks, thank you very much. We'd be glad to stand for questions. Appreciate it.
You just touched on it, that a lot of these are long-term issues. It seems like this is a fairly comprehensive sort of vision for what to do about Minnesota's economy. But you also stated what's really on a lot of voters' minds right now, which is inflation, the rising prices of things right now. The governor of Minnesota is very limited in what he or she can do to control inflation. Can you talk to me a little bit about this and explain? I mean, maybe you're not really trying to solve that problem with this plan, but I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about that, if you could.
I'd be glad to, David, but I am going to ask Matt to step in too, because his background in economics will give him, if you will, a leg up on me in terms of understanding potentially some deeper things. But for me, if we just go to the simple law of supply and demand, if we can create more inventory at a lower price, that will help people be able to buy products at a lower price. For instance, the baby formula crisis. Part of the reason we had inflation on the baby formula was because the supply was so diminished that drove the demand, and the demand drove the price. We need to make certain that we're not making short-sighted decisions that might, if you will, crimp or fracture the supply chain that's providing that product. Another perhaps real-world example of that would be if we say that auto dealers have to sell vehicles that people might not be interested in buying, but that's part of the requirement, you're going to have the auto dealers have on their lots vehicles that might be difficult for them to sell. That's a cost to them. They have to cover that cost. They'll cover that cost by putting it onto the cost of the cars that they are selling. This kind of a situation is happening over and over again. I just mentioned 2 quick ones off the top of my head, baby formula and cars. That's why I'm so powerfully passionate about the potential for a private-public partnership. I think oftentimes in the private world, where if you fail, you may completely fail. You may go under. You may have to walk away from an investment, and you may have to start over. In a public arena, oftentimes, it isn't quite the same. And I think when you put the two together, we found some marriages that work. And one of them was near and dear to my heart, and that's healthcare. I think if we just do healthcare through the private sector, it's not going to work. If we just do healthcare through the public sector, it's not going to work. I don't think there's a whole lot of people want to duplicate what the National Health Service in Great Britain has going for it. I mean, nobody really wants to have to wait potentially 15 months to have their hernia fixed and put their bowels back in their abdomen wall, their abdominal wall, or 3 or 4 times a day. So I think these are some of the real world examples that I look at. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Well, how can you help people with inflation? Make their paychecks bigger. 5th highest tax burden in the country, right here. Scott and I have put it out there. Can we do away with our state income tax? What if we tried to do that? You know, the state budget's grown 75% over the last 12 years. I don't know if anybody's wages have grown. The average Minnesotan's wages have not grown 75% over the last 12 years. So over the last 12 years, Minnesotans have been taking home less and less. You know, Scott and I have put this idea out there. I'm not sure if we've shared with you, but if we just cut back on the waste and fraud and abuse that's going on in the government, we could decrease taxes. That would put more money in Minnesotans' pockets. And nobody says that the budget has to keep growing at that same rate. You know, if we went all the way back to 2019, all the way back, remember back then? 2019, and used that budget number, we'd be halfway there. We'd be halfway there just like that. And would most Minnesotans, would services be diminished? Would schools close? Not at all. But these are the ideas we want to push forward. These are the conversations that Scott and I want to have. And then, of course, creating better paying jobs that have livable wages. I was up on the Iron Range, I don't know, 10 days ago. You used the word vision, Dave. People want to know, what's the vision? That's up there. People say, what is the vision for mining here in Minnesota? What is this current administration's vision? They have no idea. But they're sitting on resources that the world needs. And the world is going to get them from somewhere. We could mine those materials responsibly in Minnesota, what they've been doing for 150 years, or we can get them from a country like China or the Congo, where there are no environmental laws, where there are no child slave labor laws. The world's going to get them somewhere. We're not going to stop buying smartphones or electric car batteries, right?
So just to clarify, you say make people's paychecks bigger. Of course, that is part of the cycle of inflation, but it sounds like what you're saying is you make their paychecks bigger specifically by reducing the amount of money the government pulls in, which doesn't play into that cycle.
Make their take-home pay bigger, I guess would be a more accurate way to say it.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Would you consider raising taxes or implementing taxes on food or on clothes or anything to make up for the potential deficit that comes with lowering income taxes?
No, I think that we're not interested in trying to go into the weeds and say, here's the operational details that would make this work. I think that so oftentimes we leapfrog over the most important part of problem solving. The most important part is trying to identify the questions that will lead us to the answers. So the questions are, what do other states do that don't have a personal income tax? And let's just take Florida. Well, Florida gets a tremendous amount of income that Minnesota wouldn't be able to get through tourism. It's a big deal. We could bump up what we're getting through tourism, and that could be through economic stimulus. And it's not about increasing a tax here, here, here. But we have arguably $1 trillion mining industry in northern Minnesota that isn't being tapped. And as Matt mentioned, we have been mining for 150 years plus. We can do this in a very responsible way, and we can steward the land. Nobody has more at stake in terms of stewarding the land than the people who have their children and their grandchildren there and want their children and grandchildren to stay nearby, to stay in those communities, and to be healthy and well. So I think that if we're looking at trying to do something bold and robust in terms of could Minnesota become one of those states that if it doesn't get to a 0% or 0 personal income tax, could we get halfway there? I'm not interested in playing a shell game and saying, we'll take from here and put it. No, I'm interested in saying, is there a way that we can become that economic hub? We haven't had a Fortune 500 company come here since 2004, I think, and that was Mosaic, and they've left. We've seen the commitment that Medtronics has to Minnesota absolutely evaporate. And I think the recent, you probably remember, is about 2 years ago, big expansion, I think 200 high-paying jobs, and it went to Colorado. So I think that we have to not constrain ourselves by trying to get too quickly to the operational details. I think we have to have people smarter than us who really know the budget. And I've sat down with some of those people, so has Matt, and we tried to get a feel for it. And the notion that if we could cut down 10% 1 year and then cap for 3 years, that we would be halfway there. That we could reduce every one of the income tax brackets in Minnesota by 50%. And we could press pause, and then we could say, okay, what else has happened during this time? And two things that would be good that would have happened would have been, there would have been an inflationary growth of revenues, which would give us some money on the bottom line to use. And the other thing that would have happened is there would have been more dollars coming to the state of Minnesota, likely, because there'd probably be people moving here, thinking about, instead of having to leave, they say, well, you know what? Minnesota's changing. They're reducing their regulations. They're trying to make a real play towards reducing income tax. If they start to demonstrate a more business-friendly culture, we'd love to tap into what Minnesota brings to the table, and what we've always brought to the table is we have a wonderful populace. We have a solid background in terms of providing K through 12 expertise. We have a solid reputation for having skilled workers, motivated men and women that want to grow our economy. So to me, I'm not interested in playing a shell game. I'm interested in having the big conversation, because I know this, if we don't have the conversation, we'll certainly never get there. It's very unusual to solve a problem that you haven't been able to articulate with a question.
So you would propose maybe an incremental approach, or starting small and then...
I think you have to go with a phase. And if you just said, let's do it over 8 years, let's do it by 2030, and then let's try to get halfway there in the first 4 years. So if you did those 2 steps, you cut it 10%, and not each department, you do this, you take the pie instead of reduce the area of the pizza by 10%. And then the second thing would be you cap the next 3 years. And then you use the surplus that we have right now to backfill, and we'd still be in the black. We'd have to look at, okay, what kind of revenue growth did we get through inflation? What kind of revenue growth did we get through new corporate activity? What kind of revenue growth did we get by people coming to the state of Minnesota and paying taxes at the level they're paying? I mean, we have things happening to Minnesota. I don't think people even realize. There's an awful lot of truckers that when they're trucking, they fill up their gas in South Dakota. They drive across the southern belt of Minnesota on 90 and fill up in Wisconsin. And when they do that, every one of those times they do that, they save $100. Shoot a mile. If I'm a truck driver, I'm going to save $100 every time I do a route. I mean, people are ingenious. They're smart. They're clever. And this is exactly what they should be doing. But to me, this is why debates are important. This is why Peggy Flanagan and Matt Brick should have a conversation. They should be talking about this in front of someone, not in a hostile situation, but they should be talking in front of Minnesota. So Minnesotans could say, I really think Brick is out to what, he's out to lunch, or Peggy's really brilliant on this. Whatever. Let's have the conversation. I think that, that's what you folks are all, investigative journalism. Folks, I appreciate it very much. You've been great. We do plan on having a press conference on Monday, and we do plan on revisiting our concerns about the waste and fraud associated with Feeding Our Future program. There's more information coming forth, and we're doing our level best to try to take that information and put it in a compact, readily understandable time frame so that people can understand that something went terribly wrong. And I don't think we can say that Minnesota's done enough with the concern. So, thanks so much, appreciate it.